So, today we are going to be discussing the Mexican Muralist movement of the 1920s, and we are going to discuss the social and political reasons for the emergence of this movement and the goals and outcome of the Mexican Muralists. So, the reason why the Muralist movement primarily happened was because the Mexican government wanted to promote pride and nationalism after a very long war, which was the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And this war lasted 10 years. It ended in 1920, and it was at this point in time when the government was trying to push this to promote cultural identity and nationalism. It was also another way to educate a primarily illiterate working class who did not have access to education. And what better way to educate the masses than to offer them visual artworks so that they can better understand their country's history. Okay, so in making art more publicly accessible, it eliminated the ideas of elitism in art. In this point in time, the majority of people that had access to art were elite rich. They were the ones that were buying art. They could afford to access art, and this made art very inaccessible. But in making art public and having it be free and out in the open, it made art accessible to everyone. And these murals primarily consisted of course, showing their country's history and promoting nationalism and pride in one's cultural identity, primarily due to the fact that the population consisted of Spanish and indigenous people and mixed race people as well. And it also had the political propaganda of the Muralists, who were primarily communist. When it came to making the art that the commissioners wanted, the Mexican Muralists would rebel against the narratives that the commissioners were trying to push on them. And this was seen as very controversial when they would pay them money to make a certain work and they wouldn't do it. And this was the case for one of Diego Rivera's works, who I will show in a bit in a few upcoming slides. So, the main three Mexican figures at that time were known as Los Tres Grandes, or the Three Greats. And these were the three main Mexican muralists. Of course, they weren't the only muralists, but they were the most known and likely the ones that got the most commissions. So these three went by the name of Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Cisqueros, and Jose Clemente Orozco. Diego Rivera, who you might know, was the husband of Frida Kahlo, and him and his wife were both members of the Mexican Communist Party. And while Rivera stayed in Europe, he was influenced by European modernism and Cubism, and this in turn inspired him to depict the Mexican working class with simple forms, and he depicted them as noble and strong with bright and vivid colors. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the works that had controversy of Rivera's was Man at the Crossroads, and it was commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller in 1933. And one of the primary reasons that Rockefeller commissioned Diego Rivera was because his mother at the time was a huge fan of Rivera's work, and Rockefeller wanted Rivera to create a work of art that made the audience pause and think and made them envision a better future. And keep in mind, this was during the time where it was the Great Depression and people were struggling a lot, especially financially. And Rivera came back to Rockefeller and he told him that he had the idea to show a work of art that depicted communism versus capitalism and how they clashed. And initially, Rockefeller was fine with this idea, but when it came to the end result of the work, Rockefeller was not happy with who was depicted in the fresco. And it was none other than Vladimir Lenin, who was a Russian communist revolutionary, and that was a big no-no to have him in the fresco. And of course, Rockefeller asked Rivera to remove him from the portrait, the fresco, and Rivera put his foot down. He would not comply with it at all, and unfortunately, this fresco was destroyed a year later, and another artist was commissioned a few years later afterwards. But I do think that Rivera had the opportunity to remake this painting elsewhere. The following artist is David Alfaro Cisqueros, and he was a Mexican communist as well. He met Rivera in Paris at the same time, and they were both influenced by Cézanne, who created the bridge between post-impressionist and Cubism artwork. And Cisqueros became a teacher in the US, and in 1936 he holds a experimental workshop in New York, and none other than Jackson Pollock attends, and he ultimately becomes influenced by Cisqueros, and he attributes Cisqueros to the famous splash work signature of his artwork. So Cisqueros made a painting titled Echo of the Scream in 1937 with enamel paint, and he made this painting while he was in Spain, and he actively opposed Francisco Franco's dictatorship in Spain, which caused the Civil War. And this work depicted here at the right, which again is titled Echo of a Scream, depicts a child that is crying, and he's alone, and you can see his face is enlarged behind him, and he is almost consumed by pain and sorrow, and it makes you think about the whereabouts of this child's family and the rubble around him. Perhaps the rubble is the remains of his home, and it's very difficult to see a work like this, and I think that is what Cisqueros wanted to portray, the pain and sorrow that comes in the aftermath of war. The next artist is Jose Clemente Orozco, and he's known, well, he first started as a caricature illustrator for Mexico City newspapers before he got into muralism, and he was largely influenced by Jose Guadalupe Posada, who is known for being a very famous Mexican lithographer. And Orozco painted the painting titled Prometheus at Pomona College during the first few years that he started living in the United States. Right here is Prometheus, and it was made in 1930. It is a fresco, and it is 20 by 28 feet, and it depicts the Greek titan Prometheus, who is reaching towards the heavens, and he's trying to catch fire to give to the humans. And it took Orozco about 3 months to finish, and he used many students as models during his time there to finish the work. And this is another work by Cisqueros, and it's titled The Banquet of the Rich, and it was made between the years 1923 and 24, and of course it's a fresco. And this work was painted for a school in Mexico titled Escuela Nacional Preparatoria. And upon looking and observing the work, one can tell that Orozco kept his style from his old days as a caricature illustrator. One could tell by the features on the characters, and upon further observation of the work, one can see that below the composition is a depiction of the working class fighting amongst each other, and the people at the top are the elite, and at the far right you can see a man in a top hat laughing and pointing at the working class fighting amongst each other. And I think this is a work that very well depicts the issues going on at the time, where the working class lacked the understanding of class consciousness and learning to work together to fight the elite that benefited from the working class fighting amongst each other. So a video that I would like everyone to watch is titled Los Tres Grandes, Vida Americana, Mexican Muralist Remake American Art between 1925 and 1945.
José Clemente Orozco, Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, the Mexican muralists known as Los Tres Grandes. They created monumental visions of struggle and heroic triumph, oppression and popular power. But there's another side to these artists, an untold story of cross-cultural exchange that would alter the course of American art forever. In the 1920s, a profound change swept across Mexican society. A 10-year civil war had finally drawn to a close. The new government enacted progressive social reforms that empowered workers and farmers, but this transformative project wasn't so simple.
There was no shared culture, no sense of a Mexican national identity.
People were fed up with others telling them what their identity was.
The government turned to the arts. They commissioned grand public murals depicting the history and everyday life of the nation's people. Los Tres Grandes rose to the task.
They were radical, they were revolutionaries at their time, and they showed ideas that hadn't been seen before. These depictions were represented at a monumental size, and so people were able to see themselves represented in these works.
The heart of what we're doing belongs with people, and we want real people to be engaged with real ideas.
Artists including the Mexican painter Frida Kahlo, the Italian photographer Tina Modotti, and the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein joined the vibrant avant-garde scene emerging in Mexico. But it was the epic art of the muralists that captured the Americans' imagination.
They'd never seen anything like that. They began to flood U.S. journals about what was called the Mexican Renaissance. So it brought down to Mexico a huge number of American artists.
As political power shifted, mural commissions declined, and Los Tres Grandes looked north to the United States.
The period when the Mexican muralists came to the US, the country was going through the Great Depression.
So the Mexican artists came and they really provided a sense of encouragement to artists that were grappling with the Depression and really provided a vision for an art that would be connected to society and that would have a social role.
Jose Clemente Orozco was the first to come to the United States. His mural for Pomona College in California depicting the mythical Greek titan Prometheus caused a sensation.
The quality of the work and the strength of the expression was something that really hadn't been seen in America.
Someone who really appreciated and thought the world of his work was Jackson Pollock. Pollock went to Pomona College. I call it kind of a pilgrimage to see Orozco's mural.
And Pollock was overwhelmed. He said it was the best painting in the contemporary world. And he kept an image of it in his studio throughout the 1930s.
Jacob Lawrence was also influenced by Orozco, whom he met while working on his Migration series. He admired the muralist's commitment to public art that engaged with social and political issues.
When I look at the Migration series, it is a call to action. And it asks me to ask myself, what am I creating that is monumental in scope, that has the power to change through time?
Diego Rivera was the second of Los Tres Grandes to arrive in the U.S.
He's considered at that point the hero of the Western world. He embodies the spirit of the Mexican Revolution.
Inspired by his experiences in the U.S., Rivera gave expression to a new vision of modern American industry in a mural at the Detroit Institute of Arts.
His idea about creating a national epic was something that was very influential on American artists.
I think he understood politically the power of representation, that even if it wasn't happening in society actually, that it was an aspirational possibility.
Siqueiros was the last to arrive in the U.S. He was a radical in every way.
What was most important was to produce not only revolutionary art in terms of content, but also in terms of materials. How the material was what contained the revolutionary potential as well, like the techniques and the methods that you employed.
Siqueiros quickly learned that his politics didn't always go over well with his American patrons. His second U.S. commission, Tropical America, overlooked a touristic Olvera Street in downtown Los Angeles.
They wanted something kind of tropical, almost like Brazil, something exotic. And being Siqueiros, he said, I'm not gonna give that to them. So he decided to paint a really shocking image of an indigenous figure being hung as a way of representing the ideals of anti-imperialism.
Shortly after its unveiling, Tropical America was partly whitewashed. 2 years later, it was completely painted over. In 1936, Siqueiros set up his experimental workshop in New York City. Jackson Pollock was one of the attendees.
They would put canvas on the floor and throw paint, splatter it, put things on the canvas. That experience that he had of being free of all conventions really became the hallmark of Pollock's mature style.
By the 1940s, Los Tres Grandes had moved back to Mexico and continued creating their monumental murals and works of art. But the impact continued to reverberate through the work of the many artists whose lives they touched over the years.
This exhibition is really rewriting art history.
It's a testament to a huge amount of bonds that exist between the two countries.
The point of consideration for us as individuals, as artists, as a society, when we enter a show like this, in this political moment, is exactly what we want from art.
So to conclude this presentation, the Mexican muralist movement was a catalyst for the United States to realize that they needed to make the WPA, which stands for the Work Progress Association, to uplift the American people after the effects of the Great Depression. And I believe that they took cues from Mexico, who had dealt with a bloody 10-year war, and they also needed to find a way to uplift their people. And these are my references.